Author's Preface. This novella/short fiction is about one of the characters from my book, The Butterfly Dragon 1, Heroes of Our Own, a character named Alicia Weston, who is a brilliant biochemist and quantum biologist in the cutting edge of biological research, who just happens to reside along with many of the other characters from the world of the Butterfly Dragon in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. This is perhaps one of my personal favorite stories from the Butterfly Dragon series that focuses on Alicia's pursuit of understanding the mechanisms at play in the face of the quantum-based mystery of the SY349 formula. Please read on. There's much to be understood, not to mention it's a great and inspiring story, at least from my perspective and enjoyment of such a philosophically engrossing scientific topic. During the course of the story of the Butterfly Dragon 1, Heroes of Our Own, Alicia creates a two-phase formula consisting of an ingested medical capsule, the SY349A, and a spray that is applied to any sort of worn garment, such as clothing or jewelry. The formula of Alicia's creation for the company that she's employed at that time, Tynan and Associates Medical, allows the effects upon the body of the SY349A to be manipulated by the artistic and aesthetic design of whatever the SY349B is applied to. In other words, for the first time in medical history, a researcher has somehow integrated the subjectivity of the observer of the collapse of the wave function in the quantum mechanical interpretation of physics as a part of the medical treatment itself. That is, that the medical treatment and its effectiveness is influenced in an almost placebo-nocebo-like manner by the subjectivity of the person receiving the treatment versus the influence of the artistic design of the aesthetic component. For Alicia, this proves to be a conundrum that violates the very foundations of the fabric of reality that finds its root in a long-standing argument held by Einstein and Niels Bohr with regard to the impact of the observer upon the unfolding of causality and its importance with regard to what is formally called objective collapse. The collapse of the wave function between one of two possible outcomes at the subatomic level, anytime such an event has two possible outcomes. Bohr's interpretation of the results of experimentation deemed that observation has a probabilistic influence and causes the wave function to collapse, branching into two parallel universes, one to accommodate each possible outcome, while Einstein found Bohr's theory to be absurd. When debating the probabilistic nature of objective collapse, Einstein himself is quoted as arguing to Bohr that God did not play dice with the universe. Bohr, in response, casually replied to Einstein, "Stop telling God what to do." Bohr was insisting to Einstein that rather than trying to shape reality to fit their theories, that they should shape their theories to fit reality. A very important point of debate even to this day in modern theoretical physics. Alicia, a physical scientist herself, though amazed by what she discovered, somehow felt betrayed by this invisible effect we have upon objective collapse. After all, if subjectivity is the prime factor in every branch point with regard to every energetic interaction whose possibilities have a dual outcome of variable degrees, hidden between the mystery of the Planck scale, the smallest of any measurement that we can make, whether it be space, time, or energy, then we all have an effect on reality, and very obviously a great responsibility inasmuch. However, is this mysterious influence even real or measurable, or is it an illusion that arises as a result of us imbuing a mystical quality as a result of our reverence of nature that simply isn't there? Very much a case of the battle between the perspective of idealism versus pragmatism. This story takes place before The Butterfly Dragon 2, What Different Eyes See, and introduces us to some of the key characters that appear in the two sequels after Heroes of Our Own. This story focuses on Dr. Alicia Weston and her dream of meeting and speaking with one of her life inspirations, Professor Bryce Maxwell. It's a bite-sized story with much breadth and depth, and serves as the inspiration for what eventually became What Different Eyes See, the Vietnam Special Edition, a chapter from What Different Eyes See that finds the entire cast caught up in an adventurous mystery when their Airbus is forced to land in the scenic destination of Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Whereupon they meet with Mrs. Hue Vun, coming soon to my YouTube audiobook channel and to my TikTok site. I would like to thank the Perimeter Institute of Theoretical Physics and many esteemed lecturers over the years whose work I've been following since the late 1990s, back when it had a different name, and long before the current fervor over quantum computing. Quantum computing was a term I originally read about in Omni magazine in the 1980s, hence proving what a wonderfully speculative gem that publication was and still is to this day. Also, I'd like to thank Google AI Studio, 11 Labs, and DeepSeek AI and Windows Copilot, all of whom made the lightly edited and updated audiobook version of this short story possible. I had already finished most of the edits by the time Grok AI arrived, but I'll be using it with some of the upcoming stories and audiobook conversions where it will get the credit it deserves. Thank you to the YouTube content producing community as well, whose edge can be as sharp as a blade or as ticklish as a feather. They can sometimes put the thorns on roses or put the red on rubies. In all truth, I suppose that you can't have one without the other, although maybe you might contend with that idea by the time you've finished reading or listening to this version of the story.
Shhh! Digital Media presents The Butterfly Dragon, A Piano, a Full Glass, and the Disappearance of Time by Brian Joseph Johns. Looking Glass. She stepped through the beaded doorway and into the lounge, a dimly lit recluse for those more interested in good conversation amidst the backdrop of the cerebral tickling of piano keys. A variety of tables and booths were artistically, or perhaps strategically, distributed throughout the lounge, most being occupied by those deep in engaging banter. The sound of the piano had presence, yet it did not intrude upon her or any of the audience's front-line conscious space. Instead, it laid down a path, offering a turn here or a glance there, giving the room its complete ambiance, giving it space where it lacked dimension, and time in the absence of anticipation, adding pastels for the auditory senses. Alicia stepped as quietly as she could, not trying to upset the mood, yet still making her way towards her quarry on this night. Her shoulder-length magenta-highlighted golden hair responded to the colored lighting, giving her the appearance of a brilliant angel. She was not a vixen, though her body was sleek and fit, perhaps even as much so as that of an Olympic athlete. She'd not earned it through a strict regimen of exercise, but rather as a result of her own brilliance. She was one of the scientific pioneers of quantum biology, a field which sought to explain and exploit the relationship between biology and the quantum interpretation of matter, energy, time, and space in the form of quantum information. After years of research and development at Tynan and Associates, the company which owned the research lab in which she worked, she had a breakthrough, the SY349 as she dubbed it, aptly with the initials of one of her deceased mentors, followed by a number indicating the number of development cycles it had taken to arrive at that version of the formula. A formula which targeted and modified the human genome using copies of itself that were taken from alternate pocket universes in two directions of time. It was a front-runner treatment that was being developed for dealing with degenerative diseases such as lymphoma, Hodgkin's, and muscular dystrophy.
At the genetic level, it could defeat even hereditary cancer. It worked by allowing the RNA messenger used to build a genetic sequence during cellular mitosis access to a gene copy that was taken from a completely different universe, but from the same organism. A copy of the genome that was taken from a version of oneself that was in a much better genetic state. Cancer cells weren't mutations, they were choices the body forgot it could unmake. On the night she received the reports from the test lab that 95% of the cancerous lab animals treated with the SY349 had no signs of cancer within a month of the application of the treatment, it had been tested in a variety of biology simulations of the human body as well, with the same results. The SY349 was the beginning of a whole new era in treatment, and with Alicia having spent her whole life developing it, she decided on that fateful night to test it on herself. Irresponsibly so, but she'd done it nonetheless. It had turned her from a slightly out-of-shape scientist and researcher into an Olympic-class athlete over the course of an hour. Her body literally transformed before her eyes, and very painfully, to change her into this new ideal visage of which she was not accustomed. She hadn't developed the treatment to cure weight problems or neglect of the body. Instead, she'd targeted degenerative diseases and cancer itself by giving the body the ability to recall from an infinite quantum library of backups of the original DNA from the first stem cells in a patient's own body. Essentially, the chemical components and the RNA itself was not only referring to the existing DNA of the cell, but to another copy of the DNA hidden in a parallel universe only detectable at the molecular level by the use of chemistry and quantum mechanics. However, it did not rely on the many worlds interpretation of objective collapse to function correctly. Regardless of the proof for or against the many worlds interpretation, her formula still had the exact same effects upon cellular mitosis, whether that information was originating from parallel universes or multidimensional quantum information. It neither proved nor disproved either. It functioned regardless of the hypothesized nature of its analysis.
Furthermore, the effectiveness of this transmogrification, as She'd coined it, could be affected by something she'd referred to in her paper as the artist's effect. The ability to shape the cure according to the aesthetics of whatever the cure and formula itself was applied to. The fact that this could occur at all had enormous implications for science and medicine that were as significant as the placebo effect, if not even more critical to the healing process. It was for this reason that she'd arrived here on this night at the Looking Glass Lounge. Her dinner jacket and skirt hugged her body to just above her knees, compelling to those who appreciated the fine curves and subtle beauty that graced every woman's body. Alicia was most certainly intellectually seductive, though seduction was the last thought on her mind. She'd save that for later, perhaps sneaking into bed at home where her spouse Walton Norler would be waiting for her. For now, she pursued the world of quantum mystery. Norler had encouraged her to do this. He'd been with Alicia long enough to know how much she loved her work, a gifted researcher. Her obsessive long nights going over the atomic bonds of the molecules she'd constructed in one of her many thought experiments, their interactions with proteins and amino acids, and the resultant impact they had upon the process of cellular mitosis. He did his best to discuss her work with her, but often it just went over his head. Norler was certainly apt, though his abilities as such tended to shine in investment strategy, finance, and the boardroom. He'd known that she needed someone with whom she could speak about her work, someone who could understand her and challenge her. He knew that she needed that in order to grow, and so his concern for her put him to task. He'd been going over an investment quarterly in his office one day when he spied a column written about one of her university heroes, Bryce Maxwell. As a professor and lead researcher, he'd been one of Alicia's inspirations early on, and perhaps the one who'd pointed the way to her breakthrough in quantum transmogrification. When Alicia and Norler had began dating, she'd often bring up Maxwell's name in conversation, excitedly and enthusiastically. At first, he'd thought that it might have been a university crush, but after he'd gotten to know her, he realized that this was one of her heroes.
The article he'd come across had listed Maxwell's past research projects, as well as his extracurricular activities. Bryce Maxwell, it turned out, was also a concert and lounge pianist who'd gigged for years in the city of Toronto, even playing some of its most well-known venues, such as the Montreal Bistro and Top of the Senator. In the column, Bryce had plugged his current venue at the Looking Glass Lounge, a small but popular venue just south of the city center. Norler had called the lounge himself, reserving a table for Alicia up front and close to the piano. The rest, he reasoned, was up to her. For the week before her reservation, she played down the whole thing, though inside she was deeply excited. On that night, she prepared her most important paper notes and put them in her journal beside her tablet computer.
Lynn had even coordinated with Nordler and had sent Alicia one of her recent evening wear designs, especially customized for her night-style alter ego, should her presence be required. Alicia stood before the mirror, examining herself. "How do I look?" Alicia asked Nordler, who admired her from down the hall. "You look stunning. How do you feel?" Nordler asked her. "Great, honey. Not stunned, I hope." She turned away from the mirror and approached him, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered in his ear, planting a soft kiss on his lips. "Stunning, not stunned. Enjoy yourself tonight, honey. I'll be here if you need me," Nordler said, brushing his lips over hers gently so as not to mess up her makeup. "Don't wait up. Keep my side of the bed warm if you can," Alicia said to him as she grabbed her journal and slipped out the door. Alicia found her reservation and seated herself a short distance from the stage, where Bryce already sat playing a quiet instrumental and clearly enjoying himself. The waiter arrived, taking her order of gin and tonic. As he finished the piece, he turned to see Alicia and threw her a wink. She blushed as the applause filled the lounge. Bryce stood bowing before taking a seat behind the microphone on the piano. Alicia's waiter brought her gin and tonic and placed it gingerly on the table. Long before I'd started my long career in quantum research, I'd always had this idea that one day I'd be an instrumentalist. A pianist, actually. Imagine that. So what a coincidence it is to be here playing this gig, behind a 14-foot grand piano. Though a 12-footer would have done nicely too. Life really is a big string of coincidences, one connecting to another and so on. That actually is what the world of quantum physics is all about. Coincidences, though coincidences tend to take on a different meaning depending upon which side of the event you're on, or so Carl Gustav Jung observed. Before, during, or after it, especially if you remove time altogether, which many have tried to do, if only to make sense of it. I guess there's no time like the present, so that's my next piece. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. You'll have to decide. Bryce started the piece as he finished his sentence. Alicia's smile stretched from ear to ear, mulling over what he had just said. Was he talking to her? After all, she was there to discuss quantum physics with one of the foremost theorists and researchers in her field. How'd he know she was here to discuss such a thing with him? She blushed again slightly as she pulled herself together, retrieving her notes from her notebook journal. She fished through her tablet, bringing up the files she wanted to share, where she waited for the opportunity to do so, enjoying the music as she did.
Alicia took a moment to look around the room, recognizing some fellow researchers and other fans of Bryce. There was Nelson Tanner, a biologist from Montreal who'd had successes against melanoma via gene therapy. She recognized Zhangni Wang, a lady and popular researcher who just received her master's degree in mathematics from the University of Toronto. Her thesis had been about the artificial stimulation of mitosis and temporal skewing of a cell's internal clock. She even coined herself as being the first computational biologist. Katya and Victor Piotr sat in a booth just across from her. They were husband and wife research team who'd emigrated from Russia to Waterloo, where they'd worked with phages. They'd published a paper on the fact that phages could be used to accelerate the delivery of medicines through the bloodstream directly, acting as carriers for the treatments if engineered correctly so. They both waved upon recognizing Alicia. She waved back politely as Bryce's piece finished. There was a moment of applause as Bryce once again spoke into the mic. "Thank you very much. Coincidence? I think not, for there's more to this journey than meets the eye. Ask any physicist or philosopher and they'll confirm it, be they speaking of bosons or even bozos, but we didn't bring the lab with us tonight, did we?" Bryce posed for the audience. "Just play the piano and let the real physicists do the work," came a response from one of Bryce's academic peers in the audience. "I guess we can leave the bosons in the lab, but there's no getting rid of the bozos. I guess maybe that's because they're gluons. Or really glued on. If any of you out there discover some new elementary particles, be sure to use the suffix on rather than off, if you kindly could," Bryce replied without losing a step. The audience broke out in laughter, and a ripe smile stretched across the heckler's face. Alicia even found herself laughing and feeling very much at home all of a sudden. I'm going to take a short break and enjoy the company of some of my peers. I hope you're enjoying your evening here at the Looking Glass Lounge, and it looks like our Alice for the evening has arrived. So I guess that makes me the Cheshire Cat and my wife Wendy the Queen of Hearts." With those words, Bryce stepped down from the stage, signaling Alicia that he'd be right back.
She watched him with interest as he made his way over to the bar where they'd prepared a drink for him. He took a moment and shook hands with another one of his peers before making his way back over to Alicia's table. "Or the Mad Hatter," Alicia suggested to her idol and peer, Professor Bryce Maxwell. "Alicia Weston, to what occasion do I own this wonderful surprise?" Bryce addressed her. Mr. Maxwell, you remember me from the talk I gave a few years ago on quantum transmogrification at the University of Waterloo, don't you? I mean, you've already accomplished so much in your career and life, especially in the field of quantum biology," Alicia asked him. "Do you mind if I join you?" Bryce asked her candidly. "I was hoping you would. Please do," she said, awkwardly standing as he seated himself. "You didn't come all the way down here to the Looking Glass to speak about quantum physics, did you?" he asked her. "Well, you see, I've always had a fantasy that we'd meet someday, and fantasy can be such a misunderstood word sometimes. So many use it to implicate sexuality, whereas it can mean something so friendly and intimate as a good conversation, right?" Bryce spoke, easing her tension a bit. "Exactly. This is a little cliché in some ways, but it's important," Alicia assured him. "Most certainly it is. I've met some of the most interesting people I know in much the same way, just as I'm sure I've added another to that list. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe there's something happening on another level, too small for the eye to see. Maybe you wanted it to happen. After all, that's how I met my wife. Let's drink to serendipity," he said to her, offering his glass in a toast. She met his glass with her untouched gin and tonic like a chime. "This is the looking glass we'll look through tonight, but not too much, of course." Bryce savored his drink and sat back, taking in Alicia. "I see you've prepared for this. Are these your research notes?" Bryce asked her. "The most important ones, anyway. Here's the numbers, though. I've been trying to statistically document and analyze the data regarding the artist's effect. You're familiar with the SY349 program, aren't you?" Alicia asked him, feeling a little more comfortable.
Absolutely. The artist's effect, the measurable impact that aesthetic design can have upon shaping the effects of the SY349 formula. Like the diametrical opposite of the placebo effect, if you would. I remember your talk at University of Waterloo, by the way. He responded as she handed him some papers with her significant numbers circled. "I saw your data in the paper you published last year. Very impressive. I can't help but think that you might be looking in the wrong place for the answers, though," Bryce said, going over her data. "I've been very thorough," Alicia assured him. "You certainly have, but we're dealing with a very elusive idea here. The numbers might point in a direction, but I think you'll find that the direction between experiments that it points will appear random, inconsistent, boggling, and counterintuitive," Bryce suggested, looking at the numbers. "Are you saying that there's something wrong with my data, my experiments?" Alicia asked him, a look of shock crossing over her face. "Nothing at all of that sort, my dear Alicia. Your experiments or your data are not a problem at all. There is nothing wrong. Please don't condemn yourself before you really start looking at the mystery. You're looking for an answer. You need to ask yourself if what you seek the answers to is really what is needed to accomplish what you're trying to do with the SY349 and quantum transmogrification," Bryce suggested to her. "As researchers and scientists, theory, experimentation, and hypothesis are the ways we collect data, so we can use what we learn to—" Alicia started as she paused, realizing her idealism was speaking for her. "To make the world a better place. I see you caught yourself whilst being pulled in by the gravity of idealism. Gravity is good, and so is a moral compass. Your work seeks to save lives and make life better without dire consequences, without a price tag paid by the biosphere, or any of its creepy crawlies for that matter. That tells me that it's somehow built into your intuition, yet you're trying to restrain yourself. Sometimes, though, we need to think without constraints that are misleading, so our thinking and insight isn't so rigid as to hide the truth from us," Bryce said to her as she took a drink.
how do we know how to use the artist's effect to our advantage without data?
It isn't imperative for me to know the mechanical processes at work when I press one of the keys on a piano in order to be able to play, is it? I mean, all of that happens under the hood, and it doesn't require me to know a thing about it, unless maybe I need to tune it. Bryce suggested through metaphor. Are you saying that we can use the artist's effect without understanding it? I mean, what would happen if the piano broke? Wouldn't you want to be able to fix it? Alicia returned. The piano isn't broken and is broken, much the same as the biological processes that you're trying to affect aren't broken and are broken. It's a point of view, because the concept of broken is subjective. With the SY349, you're trying to shape the next generation of cells in such a way that they benefit the current whole in a biological specimen. Who's to say that specimen is broken or not broken? That concept depends on what is needed to survive within the current time span of that specimen. Does it mean that we're broken just because we don't breathe water like fish? Yet none of us can live without it. We have land that we can live on, and air that we breathe, and water that we drink. If we tried to survive underwater, then by all means, we could probably say that we're broken, Bryce explained to Alicia. But other seagoing mammals live in the water, such as porpoises and narwhals. They can't breathe water. We essentially have the same respiratory systems as they do, and they're not broken. Alicia tried to correct him. You're missing the point. They're not broken because they can't breathe water, and they're broken because they can't. That doesn't mean that we need to fix them. Take a cancerous porpoise or narwhal, on the other hand, a part of its natural biology that is working in detriment to the entire organism's own survival. A living thing is not broken just because it has different capabilities of survival and metabolism, so long as its own biology is working towards its own ends. Of course, we're not going to get into evaluating its fitness to bear offspring. When people start making decisions related to who gets to have babies and who doesn't on the basis of genome, we're in for a world of abuses and an era of elitism. I mean, we certainly wouldn't selectively ban procreation of those with a history of cancer now, would we? Bryce posed to Alicia.
I think we buried eugenics during the talk I gave at University of Waterloo. I mean, limiting someone's right to procreation on the basis of genetics is the same thing as encouraging those who believe in such nonsense in superior genetics to have more children. Both ideas seem very absurd and outright disgusting to me. Alicia confirmed her stance once again for Bryce. As they are to myself as well. Is the porpoise inferior to fish because it doesn't breathe water? If it has cancer, though, that's a threat to its life and a possible gamble for its offspring, though no reason for the poor porpoise to have its ability to procreate taken from it. I take it that the SY349 isn't being used to make porpoises that breathe water, right? Bryce asked her, keeping his eyes on her as he waited for her answer. Alicia paused a moment as she weighed her answer. She'd used the formula to imbue herself with superhuman abilities. Would that qualify as giving gills to a dolphin? Had she overstepped the moral line with regard to genetics and the sanctity of life? She'd already spent a year moralizing her decision to test the formula on herself. No, the SY349 has been used in a large number of cases as a successful treatment candidate against a multitude of forms of cancer, Alicia assured him as best as she could. Good. I'm very much intrigued by the artist's effect, though I have to be honest with you, Alicia. I'd hate to be the peer of the scientist who'd have supported limiting the procreation rights of Mr. Stephen Hawking's mother over issues of eugenics and genetic diseases, Bryce said to her approvingly. There was a pause as Bryce's smile returned, and the serious tension of the conversation disappeared for a moment. If you'll excuse me, I have to get up on stage and perform another set. We'll continue this talk if you'd like during my next break, Bryce asked her. I hope you don't mind, Alicia confirmed with him. Not at all. This is just the kind of thing that needs to be spoken of in class as much as it does in the labs. I'd be willing to bet that some of the best theoretical work takes place in lounges like this one. So let's see if we can't help you find an answer, Bryce said as he politely took his leave of her table. I'll be waiting, Alicia said with both a smile and a tear on her cheek.
Numbers. A few of the guests in the lounge had taken to the floor for a close dance during the last song in Bryce's set. A moody ballad in which he sang with his weathered voice. He wasn't technically a singer, but he certainly had the heart of one, and that's what had warmed hers. He wasn't pretending to be anything but himself, and that was an honesty that it had taken him a long time to earn. Living up to his own legend, Alicia had thought.
He sang the last words in the song and bowed for the audience, most of whom were on the dance floor by that point. I've got to take one more break and then I'll be up here for one more set. The finale if you'd have it, though I'm only just getting started. Care to join me? Bryce stood and departed the piano, making his way to the bar for a drink before returning to Alicia's table. That was brilliant, Alicia said to him, standing as he joined her at her table. That was the mood, the right time and the right place. The right crowd, Bryce said to her, clanking glasses once again. Now let's talk about numbers and reality, Bryce said with a measured sense of retrospect. I thought you said these numbers wouldn't show us anything, Alicia said without any hint of resent. I said they wouldn't point the way to what we need to understand with regard to the artist's effect. In fact, your numbers give us the most interesting clues that something very intriguing is going on here. Something that Sylvia was onto during her time as a researcher. You knew a researcher named Sylvia? Alicia asked, surprised that Bryce had brought up her name. Sylvia Upadhyaya, a brilliant theoretical physicist and perhaps one of the greatest laboratory researchers with whom I've had the pleasure of working. She was also one of the funniest women I've ever met. She had a wonderful sense of humor. Humor seems always to pair well with motivation and curiosity, don't you think? Bryce said directly to Alicia. So you knew her. I can't believe this. I used to volunteer at a home for the elderly. She had retired there when I was like 16. We used to talk shop, as she called it, all the time. Actually, I met Sylvia around the same time that I met my best friend Halen at school, Alicia added, directing her ponderance back to Bryce.
Life is full of coincidences, and many of them are meaningful. Enough so that if you were to measure them statistically, the data would look something like your numbers. Something Sylvia was quite comfortable with at that time, in a time when most researchers were writing such data off as the placebo effect, Bryce suggested to her. So you two were peers at that time? Alicia asked Bryce. Years before. She was a mentor of sorts, though I've had my share of heroes too, Alicia. We all have someone that inspired us enough to get over our fear and to really try. She was amongst those who'd helped me similarly. It's no surprise to me that you also knew her, for the line that connects us is invisible, and its name is serendipity. I remembered when she left the field for medical reasons, though I'd suspected something else was afoot. 4 years later, I stood with her closest family and friends at the crematorium to wish her a farewell on her final departure and possible return as she'd have it. I suppose that people live on through their impact upon those they affect. For all intents purposes, she's alive within us by way of the effect she had on us. Bryce raised his glass again, and Alicia met it. I'd known that I wanted to be a researcher. It was Sylvia that opened my eyes to quantum phenomenon, though she only referred to them as coincidences, kind of like you do. Well, Sylvia and I had very different beliefs and a different understanding of how the universe worked. We had some great debates between us. She certainly kept me on my toes, even back when I was primarily a pragmatist, more so than a surrealist. So, we found a thread between us, Alicia. One that certainly provides some compelling evidence but counterintuitive numbers. Perhaps Gödel's ideas are at work somewhere in there, Bryce said, recalling his time with Sylvia. You mean Gödel's trickster? There's something very unappealing about the idea that a little subatomic trickster is running around between Planck's limits to our ability to measure, keeping the secrets of the universe hidden from us. Alicia's eyebrows furrowed as she spoke, with a cynical smile perched on her lips. Maybe that's because Gödel's trickster is not outside of us, but a part of us, built into the effect of subjectivity on causality where it concerns objective collapse, Bryce replied, with a smug smile of his own, laying the bait for her.
You can't just leave it hanging there. Do you care to elaborate, or do you wish to concede your point? Alicia said to him playfully. He paused for a moment, admiring her challenge. An objective universe keeps no secrets, for it has no mind, and therefore no motive. It is purely object and substance without a push. It is only effect and never cause. Like the billiards table, with the balls racked and ready to play. Nothing results until something happens. The player breaks, and everything that occurs after that is effect. The player is cause. Do you really believe that the universe is just a collection of subatomic billiards balls just waiting to be affected? There in that quantum soup is something beyond time and space that somehow binds both of those concepts together and gives them meaning, both forwards in time and backwards too. Bryce explained to her. You're talking of observation selection. Anthropomorphism, maybe? We impose ourselves upon what we perceive, to give it life and meaning. We're looking in a mirror. As a little girl, I see a teddy bear and believe it is alive, even though it is just a collection of molecules arranged to look like something alive. It has 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, and maybe some cute ears. I am seeing myself in a mirror, and the teddy bear has life, the life I've given it. Alicia responded to Bryce. It's interesting that you chose the metaphor of a mirror when explaining yourself. What's even more interesting is that just like your poor teddy bear, we are nothing more than a collection of molecules bound together by some atomic forces, but mostly composed of energy and empty space. Even your explanation lends credence to the idea that we, in fact, act as Gödel's trickster, keeping the secret of the inner workings of the universe hidden, even from ourselves. You just proved it. Now I think you owe your poor teddy bear an apology. Even Sylvia would agree, Bryce said to her, raising his glass. We're talking about how are the numbers and scientific data of such phenomena both hide and reveal the nature of reality. What does that have to do with my teddy bear? Alicia asked him with focus and discipline.
Because even as a grown woman and a scientific professional, you still have that teddy bear in you, that secret love of something and someone that becomes personified in what you do and why you do it. The numbers only reveal the fact that it's there, wherever you focus your attention, not from where it comes. Bryce smiled as he pulled his chair out. You've got some company, it seems. I've got a set to play, and I shall return when we will conclude this conversation. Alicia, Katya, Victor, Nelson, Zheng, I'll be back to join you here at Alicia's table soon. With that, Bryce stepped back up onto the stage and sat before the piano. Please have a seat. It's so good to see you all. Alicia was surprised to see her peers. So, what were you and Bryce discussing? Asked Nelson, pulling out a chair for Zheng. Alicia paused for a moment, thinking of how to respond. By the time she did, Katya and Victor were seated beside her. 2 good friends and an elusive mystery. Sylvia Upadhyaya, my teddy bear, and Gödel's trickster. Alicia replied, igniting the fires of conversation. The unveiling of the mystery. The peers at Alicia's table went through the regimen of introductions and social familiarity, and it was 40 minutes before Katya asked the million-dollar question. Now, you've got us so intrigued that you're going to have to explain yourself. I mean, what could Sylvia Upadhyaya, a teddy bear, and Gödel's trickster have to do with one another? Katya asked, with a playful smile on her face. You'd better watch it. I think that she's just laid a trap for us to step into, responded to Katya's inquiry. Me? I was hoping you'd help me out of it. Bryce lured me in, and the same way, I might add, said Alicia, responding to Zheng and Katya. Well, don't look to me. I mean, philosophy was never my strong point. I'm a hands-on sort of man, Victor said, hoping he'd excused himself from the upcoming conversation. Just because we had to take the mandatory Ethics of Genetic Engineering 101 doesn't mean that we're well equipped to delve into Gödel, Bohr, Heisenberg, or Einstein for that matter, suggested Nelson. I think that you're selling us short. I mean, whatever happened to your sense of adventure? Your graduate's ego, that wonderful confidence of newborn graduate that can get you into an opportunity and, sometimes just as much, into trouble, Katya asked Nelson.
Pop science, public interest, continued funding, and results, Nelson replied, tipping his drink back to his lips. Pop science? There is no pop science in this day and age. I mean, we've reached the time where every science has delved so far that they are starting to overlap others.
Like our respective fields are each islands, and we've completely explored those islands and have learned that in order to continue, we have to study the ocean that connects us to other islands in order to know what goes on in our own. A merging of the sciences. This is becoming evident now, Zhang replied to Nelson as Bryce finished his tune. But that doesn't help funding. I mean, the sciences have thrived on these boundaries in the past. Like each of the sciences themselves have become a brand for investment purposes and public interest. Remember that in the past, the sciences were often competing for the same investment dollars by attempting to tackle problems from a different angle. It's only in recent years that we've seen the face of investment change and the public interest grow. We're experiencing a renaissance that has begun to erode the walls built between the sciences in the old segmented investment model. That change is happening faster than many can cope with, and the demand for something to showcase is skyrocketing, Bryce said from behind them. Not to mention that competing for the spotlight itself has changed. I mean, my husband and I spent years working on our medicinal delivery method that utilized phages as the agents of delivery before the public interest in medical biology found its way to take a look at phages themselves. We struggled with funding until that point. When we had the spotlight for just a moment, it was just enough to inject our research with public interest, and investment funding found us. Fortunately, during that time, we found the need to hang on to that spotlight, even fighting over it with other members of our field. The internet and worldwide exposure has changed things, but have we truly changed? Katya asked, looking to Bryce, who seated himself between Alicia and Victor.
The trickster. Once again, we as scientists have been fooled by the very universal devices ever present to keep us from revealing her secrets, for personal gain or something less than whatever this might be about. Don't let me get too esoteric or even theological, but they have a place in enticing curiosity and wonder, but not in discovering the truth. Segmentation of the sciences is obviously necessary in order to study them, as it is to market them for investment. Once we have achieved sufficient knowledge of our individual sciences, though, it only makes sense that the frontier itself is at the point where they overlap. We're suddenly plunged into a world where we're working with the very people with whom we've been competing for research money. That money is directly affected by public interest and the so-called spotlight Katya mentioned. Both those elements, it seems, could very much operate in contradiction to progress until that mindset of scientific segregation and competing for the spotlight has itself eroded. Sounds like the trickster at work to me, Bryce said confidently, taking a drink. The public interest for a particular thing is only so much, Nelson said, underlining his realistic point of view. But we live in a world where there are many spotlights, not just one focused on the sciences, but many with many different audiences, all interested, Zhang added. It's true. When Alex and I first presented the data for the SY349, we had several research giants fighting over us. And despite the Zek and Tormund scandal, we were able to procure long-term investment in the program, though the truth is that once we presented, we had offers from many different investors. It was a crossover of the sciences, too, between quantum physics and medical biology, biochemistry and genetics. Potentially a risky investment, though the interest in it wouldn't indicate that at all, Alicia said excitedly. Well, if this is the case, and you've obviously come here to discuss something with your hero, peer. I'm one of her peers, just as are you all, Bryce corrected Victor. All right, you've obviously come here to discuss something with your peers. Here we are, a crossing over of the sciences. Let's see what we can do, Victor suggested to Alicia.
All right, I've got a set of numbers here that were taken over the course of 2 years of testing on the SY349. As you already might know, the SY349 is a twofold treatment involving a pill which acts as a genetic dye for the body's current generation of cells. This dye affects the process of mitosis, allowing the RNA messenger access to all of the prior versions of its own genetic code by folding space-time through Bryce's discovery, quantum fold propagation. We read his paper. Katya and Victor said simultaneously, "So, you've managed to make qubits from the parts of the human genome?" Nelson confirmed with Alicia. "I'm lost. What are qubits? Are we talking about a video game here?" "No, that was qubert. Qubits are the computing components of a quantum computer, analogous to bits on a classical computer. They are essentially any particle whose superposition can be equated to more than one state, which is discerned after the collapse of the wave function," Zhang explained to Victor. "We're talking physics or biology here?"
Victor asked. Physics and chemistry. You've heard of wave-particle duality? That we can't know the position and the velocity of any fundamental particle simultaneously. They're mutually exclusive and their axes cross over at the 0 point, like a singularity. Once we measure one, we can't know the other. A qubit functions in much the same way, and its state isn't known until after the computation, because before it is simultaneously all possible states at once, like a strange bit. It's both 1 and 0 until we look at it or measure it, and then it collapses to become one of the other. Bryce explained to Victor.
So the amino acids and their molecules and atoms are qubits, in the sense of using past occurrences of the same genome as processing units in a qubit-like operation, though we're not building a quantum computer inside of the human body. The molecules and the constituent atoms that make up the amino acids for each of the genetic fields in our genome, guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine, take part in the process as Bryce's discoveries had indicated, and we confirmed that they are entangled with all of the past ancestor molecules for that particular cell. Those molecules still have information encoded in their spin that allows us to refer back to their past state in that cell. So it's like a qubit, but not a quantum computer. It's like a memory reference or pointer, more so than a calculation. Something that I'm sure Zhang could truly appreciate. All of this happens between the RNA-encoded structure of the gene as it's built through mitosis, referring backwards through ancestor proteins to find the least energy candidate and hence the most efficient. Alicia continued her explanation. That's very interesting, but what would be the problem then? Asked Nelson. The second part of the SY349 formula is a catalyst that is applied to something extracorporeal to the body. The composition of whatever it is applied to plays a part in how it affects the dye taken internally. So, for example, a necklace or bracelet. During the tests, we discovered that we could make changes to the formation of the genes and how they were expressed merely by changing the design of whatever the extracorporeal application was applied to. That is, both its composition and aesthetic design, including its colors and shape. Both have an impact upon the effect. We called this the artist's effect, and it is similar in some ways to the placebo effect, except that it is consistently measurable in each distinct case. It becomes unpredictable between cases in patients, though, as Bryce pointed out. Alicia explained, "Spooky action at a distance? More like spooky fashion sense," Bryce quipped, causing Alicia to giggle over it as she knew that Halen, too, would find humor in his words. So from what you're saying, the actual design of whatever the external application of the SY349 is applied to has an effect upon the cells affected by the internal application of the formula? Zhang asked Alicia. Precisely, Alicia replied. So you mean that something as simple as applying it to a necklace with a happy face pendant could have an effect? Katya asked. Very much so, and something of that nature definitely does, Alicia responded. That's incredible. That's a direct link to what had been discussed by Niels Bohr and Heisenberg, Jing said, once again a broad smile across her face. I think that Alicia, though, isn't so much concerned that it does happen that way as much as she wants to know how it happens that way, Nelson suggested to the group. I am ecstatic that it happens that way, and I want to know why, Alicia corrected Nelson. Now we're getting to the really interesting stuff, Bryce said to them with his own smile. Objectively subjective. How is it that the visual design of the extracorporeal of the cure can have an effect upon the mitosis of the cells affected by the internal component? Nelson asked in disbelief once he'd comprehended what was going on. There's obviously something going on between the dyed cells and the extracorporeal component, a link of some kind, Jing suggested. Entanglement? It is certainly involved, but in no way did we predict that whatever the external part of the formula was applied to would affect the process of mitosis so drastically. I mean, in our tests, we applied the external component to symbols, shapes of varying colors, and we achieved a different effect in the next generation of cells produced by their formula-affected ancestors. The only consistency we found was within individual cases, but never the same effect in two different people. In some cases, these effects were similar, but only enough so as to be barely quantifiable in most cases, Alicia told them, holding up a chart on her tablet computer.
The different colored graph lines each identify a different case or test subject. The vertical graph indicates the extent of the effects, while the horizontal graph indicates different shapes that the external component of the formula was applied to. Our first attempt to build a linguistic grammar from the data. Alicia showed them clearly so they could all see. So from what I see here, you have some consistency between test cases, but always the same or very similar effects within the individuals per exposure. That would mean Victor started as his wife excitedly interjected.
That there's something within the test subjects themselves and the way it interacts with them that is unique to them and similar enough to account for the overlap in the graph here, Katya exclaimed. Different physiology, age, sex. I mean, there's so many different variables that could be involved, Nelson said, bringing his biology expertise to the table. What about psychological factors? Zhang asked Alicia. That would imply subjectivity. I'm trying to keep this objective for the time being, Alicia responded somewhat defensively. I've seen this distribution on a graph before. It's very much the same distribution to what you'd see with a placebo/nocebo graphed against actual dosage. Because placebo is so unpredictable and involves social psychology, we use placebo to eliminate test subject error or bias, Nelson said, pointing again to Alicia's tablet. In the case of placebo, we saw no effects whatsoever. Where no treatment was applied, there was no effect upon the cellular mitosis, whereas in test subjects with a real application of the formula, there was greatly accelerated mitosis and increased metabolism as well, which would be consistent. None of the test subjects who'd taken the placebo reported any difference in their being, Alicia informed Nelson. There is one thing that would be greatly different between your test subjects, besides demographics or physiology, Bryce spoke up, having held his tongue for so long. What? Wait, Alicia responded automatically, deep in thought. You mean their perception, their cognition, and their interpretation of the symbols we tested the formula against, Alicia said in realization. That sounds consistent with your graph. People certainly have very different interpretations of symbol and color. Those interpretations would vary greatly from person to person, while some would be similar, but that would bring you back to subjectivity, Zhang added. How could someone's perception and interpretation of the external component that the formula was applied to affect the internal? I mean, they're related to perception in the mind, Alicia asked aloud, still deep in thought. When you hear a joke, there are some people who laugh and some who don't. Humor is definitely subjective, and that subjectivity is likely based upon existential experience. Life experience and memories, Katya added.
Yes, and laughing has been shown to produce anti-carcinogens as well as endorphins. It actually promotes healing. There's a situation where you have subjective interpretation that has a direct effect upon health, Nelson told his peers at the table. Subjectivity implies so many things, Alicia said hesitantly. Like responsibility? Nelson said. For what? Alicia asked a little defensively. For one's own mindset. I mean, healing can be affected by your mindset. And there's plenty of studies to suggest this. A patient has to want to get better, Nelson replied. But a person's mood and perception and frontline consciousness are affected by so many biochemical processes in the body. Naturally occurring hormones, for one, can skew a person's perception and mood greatly. So for an undisciplined mind, hormones can greatly skew a person's mindset, not to mention their cognition. How does responsibility play into that? Zhang asked Nelson. A woman's body during pregnancy is vulnerable to changes in hormone levels because of all of the changes occurring to support the life of the newborn in her womb. Is that to say that if she is too emotional, that it is her fault? Or even a case of fault? Victor asked, looking around the table. Perhaps a disciplined mind can overcome these effects, but even that takes conscious awareness of these facts. Not something that they'd readily teach in school.
Maybe that's what compassion is all about, Katya added. That's a lot to throw at any one of us. To tell us we're responsible for how we perceive the world around us? So we, as doctors and healers, have the power to effect healing by encouraging a good mindset in the patient, to make them part of their own healing process and strategy. Victor looked over the table. True, but what would stop another group of people from being lethally damaging to a person's psyche collectively, affecting their healing process by being abusive or hateful to them as a group or incognito? Don't tell me it doesn't happen, because it does. Shunning or social lambasting or social phenomenon that I've seen before. Then after being treated as such, a patient again is blamed by their own doctors for their lack of progress in healing. Once again, that's a lot to throw at a patient, and that could potentially lead to reduced immune system response just through the imbalance of hormones such stress would cause. If we're healers and responsible for a patient's good mindset in regard to healing, would that make the people who conduct social abuse murderers? Zhang posed a thought for the table. They're factors beyond our control, unfortunately, and just the same as any such factors that a doctor and patient must deal with together. Nelson was the first to reply. Why not look at it like a biological process, a challenge for the patient to be better, Katya proposed. You mean like making the patient stronger in a way? I mean, healing has nothing to do with the faces of ethos and pathos. Tragedy or suffering does not define or make healing possible. Tragedy and suffering result from health and social problems and aren't made better by social lambasting or abuse. Healing or strength of character is not being empowered by people who would do such a thing to someone. Zhang responded to Katya calmly. If I may, honey, I think what Katya was trying to say is, how you say, like if a young person learns to be strong of mind and focused, the kind of people who do such things likely won't have an effect upon them. Kind of like taking away their power to affect someone negatively by teaching them to be actively involved in determining their own mindset. Is that right, Katya? Victor asked his wife. Yes, I think I might have worded it a little bit differently, but that's worth a kiss. She gave him a peck on the cheek, making Zhang and Alicia blush a little.
That's a good point. If something of that nature is going to happen, and we can't cure it socially by discipline, laws, or reforms, then it is best to teach people how to deal with it from an early age. Makes sense? Take the power from such people away right from the beginning. I guess it even makes sense that we're discussing such a thing, though I think we'd need Jung or even Freud here to sign off on it. Zhang replied, satisfied with the answer. It just underlines the importance of the patient's mindset in the process of healing. After all, they're the proverbial observer in the Schrödinger equation, and from our data, that observer definitely has an effect on how the healing process unfolds, Alicia added. Now we're getting to the importance of symbol, color, and design, and its influence upon this process. Bryce smiled at having reached this point in the conversation. How do you jump back and forth so quickly between being a mystic and a scientist? Asked Nelson of Bryce. I'll take it that you're being rhetorical? Bryce responded. That I am. Guilty as charged. Nelson tipped his drink to Bryce. The power of artistic ability to affect the results the formula produce are very significant. We've tried applying the external treatment to a variety of items like artistically designed clothing, jewelry, and other items with a strong aesthetic presence, and in every case the design has affected the resulting treatment, Alicia said to the rest of the table. It is incredible how a piece of art can move one to ecstasy or drive them to tears, Bryce commented. So we've discerned that it is very possible that the subjective mind is playing a role in this process. So once again, we're returning to the collapse of the wave function, to Bohr and Heisenberg's interpretation of reality. Imposing that observation, perception, and mindset is what propagates this whole process of causality. Causality being the push, and effect being the results of that push. The same process that results in the formula being able to repair and mend the body so well. If we create our own reality in such a way, then why does the body sometimes work so much against our being consciously able to maintain a positive viewpoint?
Why do some people do so much the same? Alicia asked, a little bit lost in possibility.
If everyone knew that we had the power to create our own reality, or at least deal with it by nothing more than our perception and mindset, chances are they might not like the kind of world that their neighbor is going to create. Not everywhere in the world are people afforded the time and luxury of being able to think and discuss what we discussed tonight. It would certainly be arrogant to say that we make our own reality, because that would be to blame every child who was born into a war zone, or famine, or deathly struggle. While we live in peace, we certainly can affect our own life and reality, and that's really a luxury, not a privilege. And more importantly, it is one that we have to endeavor to spread and preserve the world over. As far as the SY349 is concerned, it is the power to affect reality directly, by the perception of the one receiving the treatment, affected by the designs of your friend Halen Yates and others who eventually will become a generation of aesthetic doctors, those whose work in medicine will involve not only diagnosis, but the treatment and the creation of aesthetic components to their treatment, Bryce said to Alicia and her peers at the table. I think what he was trying to say about your cure is that it's subjective, or at least powered by subjective consciousness. Certainly not a placebo, though. Something entirely different, Cages said, as Victor, Zhang, and Nelson nodded in agreement. Bryce, thank you, Alicia said as she stood and gave him a peck on the cheek. Well, I guess we can call it a night, and a great one at that, Nelson said as he stood with Zhang. Yes, I don't recall having such a wonderful conversation in some time, Keija added. We look forward to the next time, Victor smiled. The group filed out and bid each other farewell, making empty promises to call one another and to do the same thing again soon. Hi, honey. I just finished the gig. I'm saying my goodbyes and I'll be home soon. Bryce spoke on his cell phone with his wife before hanging up. Alicia and Bryce walked together to her cab. You wanted to know, and now I think that you do. I believe there's something going on behind the scenes that keeps this whole thing going, Bryce said to her as she opened the cab door. What's that? She asked him. Do you remember your talk at the University of Waterloo? Yes. What about it? She continued. After seeing your presentation, I was going to contact you to come work for me, to work on my research. Every attempt I made to contact you from that point on was futile, as if the universe did not want me to connect with you or to stop you from working on the research that you are already conducting. Gödel's trickster, maybe? Bryce suggested to her. No. Serendipity. I still got to meet you in person, and you're still the mentor I always dreamed you would be. Thanks for the wonderful night. I'll never forget this. She kissed him on the cheek and got into her cab, keeping her eyes on him. The cab drove away. As he watched the taillights slowly diffuse into one, as the cab drove off into the distance, both collapsing into one possibility from a pair. The spectrum-colored lights of the nightlife blurred, a clouded tangle of photons interlocked in a dance with the forces of nature in which yielded its only secrets via probability, or so it would seem to some. But to Alicia and Bryce, the observer did have an effect upon outcome, like the chances that Alicia would show up on the one night that he'd be playing a gig at the Looking Glass Lounge. Maybe some phenomenon in this universe had a little help from an outside force, he pondered, looking to the stars. Maybe it was all just probability, though Alicia and Bryce both knew that there had to be someone watching the dice. The cab pulled away from the building and Alicia unlocked the door to the condominium and quietly stepped in, feeling giddy and slightly tipsy. She sneaked down the hall to the bedroom, discarding her clothing as she progressed past the bedroom door. Thanks for keeping my side warm, she said, kissing Norler's ear as she got into bed. The end.